All right, up next, we're turning our attention to the engineers whose teamwork helped shape not one, but two major American automakers. Bob Casey will take us inside the careers of Fred Zeder, Owen Skelton, and Carl Breer, the trio famously known as Chrysler's Three Musketeers. And before they became instrumental in Chrysler's rise, these three brilliant minds actually got their start working together here, metaphorically, at Studebaker. Bob will walk us through how their shared beginnings, their engineering chemistry, and their forward-thinking ideas helped define an era of innovation. Please welcome a member of the Society of Automotive Historians and my predecessor and retired curator of transportation at the Henry Ford, Mr. Bob Casey, as he brings us the story of the Three Musketeers.
Well, thank you, Matt. It's always a delight to be here. In today's automotive world, Chrysler is barely a blip on the radar. There's only one Chrysler branded vehicle, a minivan. Chrysler Corporation is subsumed under one of those meaningless marketing monikers, Stellantis. And I suspect that when many people hear the word Chrysler, what they think of is a building in New York. But for decades, Chrysler Corporation was the third, and sometimes second, largest auto company in the country. And for much of that time, the corporation was noted for engineering excellence. For a quarter of a century, three men led Chrysler engineering: Fred Zeder, Owen Skelton, and Carl Breer. As Walter Chrysler himself put it, those three automotive engineers were wizards. They seemed to be part of a single extraordinary engineering intelligence. You would never find, hunt high or low, three friends more harmoniously attuned unless it might be those three men of fiction, the Three Musketeers. And while the trio made its reputation at Chrysler, they got their start as a team with Studebaker, hence the title of my talk. Bingo. There they are, with Walter Chrysler sitting there in the lower left. Fred Zeder, right here, was born in Bay City, Michigan in 1886. He worked as an apprentice machinist and mechanic at the Michigan Central Railroad before he went to the University of Michigan in 1905. He graduated as a mechanical engineer in 1909, and he was one of 25 outstanding engineering graduates across the country who was offered a 2-year apprenticeship with Alice Chalmers. Alice Chalmers was a maker of very heavy industrial equipment like steam engines, rock crushers, pumps, and boilers. In 1910, Zeder became an erecting engineer for Alice Chalmers, and he supervised the construction of a power plant in Detroit. He then left Alice Chalmers, and he joined the automaker EMF. Of course, EMF had been founded by Barney Everett, William Metzger, and Walter Flanders in 1909. And Zeder was placed in charge of EMF's engineering labs, and he oversaw the design of a new 4-cylinder engine. In 1912, Studebaker acquired EMF, and in 1914 promoted Zeder to chief engineer. He was dissatisfied with the quality of the engineering staff that he had inherited from EMF, and he set about adding proven engineering talent. One of the first people he hired was Owen Skelton, who was then working for Packard, and that's Skelton up there. Skelton was born in northwestern Ohio in the town of Edgerton in 1886. He was actually born about a month before Zeder. He worked in his father's harness and saddlery shop before attending Ohio State, and he graduated with a mechanical engineering degree at age 19. Attracted to the infant auto industry, he worked for Pope Toledo from 1905 to 1907, and then he joined Packard in Detroit in 1907 until he left there to come to Studebaker in 1914. And he was especially experienced in designing transmissions and rear axles. Now, during Zeder's time in that Alice Chalmers apprenticeship program, he met another young engineer who impressed him deeply, Carl Breer. In October of 1916, Zeder telegraphed Breer offering him a job as the head of a new research department at Studebaker. Unlike Zeder and Skelton, Breer was not a Midwesterner. He was born in Los Angeles in 1883, so he was the oldest of the trio. And he was something of an engineering prodigy. Using skills he developed in his father's blacksmith shop, he built his own electric generator at age 14. And at 16, he began designing and building a two-cylinder steam engine. Making his own patterns, he had a foundry cast the parts, he machined them himself, he purchased a boiler and a chassis, and by 1901, he had a functioning steam car. And there he is with his engine. The car looks an awful lot like the locomobiles of the period. He bought that, and he bought the boiler. The engine actually looks an awful lot like a locomobile engine of the period. So he may well have copied it, but that doesn't take any away from the accomplishment of making a steam engine from scratch when you're still in your teens. The success of the car helped him get a job after high school with the Tourist Automobile Company, but his real desire was to go to Stanford University. A year at a preparatory school earned him admission in 1905. While at Stanford, he managed to survive the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire. And upon graduation in 1909, Breer was invited to take part in that Alice Chalmers apprenticeship program. In 1911, he returned to California. He bounced through several jobs. He was the superintendent of a truck factory. He ran an auto service and accessory building. He set up his own experimental garage and shop before he got that telegram from Fred Zeder. Now, the cars that Studebaker was making then were all based on old EMF designs, and they needed a thorough makeover. Auto technology was moving rapidly, and the EMF designs were outdated. So the new engineering team produced 3 cars: a small 4-cylinder called the Light 4, a 6-cylinder called the Light 6, and a top-of-the-line 6-cylinder called the Big 6. And there they are. Everything, engines, chassis, suspensions, transmissions, bodies, was all new. They were introduced as 1918 models, and they proved to be tough and reliable. They sold well, and Studebaker President Albert Erskine called them the cars that made Studebaker famous. It's worth noting that at this time, although people quite rightly associate Studebaker with South Bend, at this time, Studebaker's automobile production and engineering operations were in Detroit. The top picture there, these were started out as the EMF factories. That's where EMF built their cars. Studebaker transformed that into offices, into a center for engineering, and it was also where they had their parts distribution operation for sending parts to dealers. And the actual production of Studebaker cars was in this plant on Jefferson Avenue, which near the Detroit River. So Zeder, Skelton, and Breer and their engineering team were doing their work for Studebaker up here. At Studebaker, the team settled into roles that they'd keep really for the remainder of their careers. As vice president of engineering with overall authority, the outgoing Zeder was the front man. When ideas needed to be sold to management, he was the guy to do it. Skelton, who was highly talented, remember, he graduated from college when he was 19, but he was modest, he was unassuming. He was put in charge of design, and Breer oversaw laboratories and research. Now, going forward, I'm going to refer to these guys as the ZSB team because it gets tiresome saying Zeder, Skelton, and Breer all the time. so I'm going to call them ZSB. Despite their success with Studebaker and with those 4 new cars, the ZSB team felt unappreciated at Studebaker, even while they were designing these new cars. Albert Erskine set up what he called a materials and specifications division to actually check up on the engineering work of the engineering department. And this M&S division really seemed only to delay things, slow things down. It didn't really contribute very much. And the ZSB team had a pretty low regard for the division's engineering talent. It broke down our morale, Breer said, just to think that we had a department over us with far less good judgment than our own. And Fred Zeder seems to have been particularly unhappy with these changes. In 1920, Walter Chrysler entered the picture. He had been president of General Motors Buick division, but after multiple clashes with GM founder William Durant, Chrysler got mad and he resigned in a huff. He didn't stay unemployed long. Bankers called on him to rescue an ailing automobile company, Willys Overland. Chrysler dealt with many of Willys' problems, but he had doubts about a new car that was supposed to be the company's savior. The company's general manager, Donald DeVore, who was yet another engineer who'd gone through this Alice Chalmers apprenticeship program and had met Zeder and Breer there, DeVore suggested that Chrysler get in touch with the ZSB guys at Studebaker. They were already dissatisfied. They were looking for a way out. And when Chrysler called and wanted their advice, they said goodbye. And in July of 1920, Zeder, Skelton, Breer, and some 15 other people, what Breer called the cream of the engineering talent that we'd built up at Studebaker, left Detroit for the Willys plant in Elizabeth, New Jersey. The new group analyzed this proposed new Willys car, and they found so many problems that they recommended that the entire design be scrapped, and we just start over. With Chrysler's approval, they set about designing a brand new car, and the resulting car with a advanced six-cylinder engine never actually got produced by Willys because William Durant re-entered the picture. After being pushed out of General Motors, this was the second time he'd been pushed out of General Motors, Durant created a new corporation, Durant Motors, and he ended up buying this Elizabeth, New Jersey plant, along with the rights to the ZSB designed a new car. And in the process of all this maneuvering, the ZSB team got pushed out. They ended up forming their own independent consulting company called, big surprise, ZSB Engineering. And for a couple of years, they did consulting work while continuing to work on the designs of an even improved version of the car they had originally designed for Willys. In the meantime, Walter Chrysler took on another turnaround job, this time with another struggling car company, Maxwell Chalmers. Knowing that Chrysler wanted to produce a car under his own name, the ZSB team in November of 1922 invited him to look at the progress on the car that they'd been designing. Chrysler was impressed and he saw his chance. In June of 1923, the ZSB team moved back to Detroit to complete work on this new car that would become the first Chrysler. Now the team's old employer, Albert Erskine, re-enters the picture. He had other ideas. He makes an offer to buy Maxwell Chalmers and this new six-cylinder car that they've been working on. So this is the second time they could lose a car that they've designed. At this point, Zeder's grudge against Erskine rears its head, and he says, I'm not having this. he vowed that he would destroy all the blueprints for this car before he would let Studebaker have it. In fact, one source says that he threatened to take a sledgehammer and destroy the prototype cars as well. In the end, Erskine's proposed purchase fell through, and Chrysler moved ahead with his original plan. And the new car would be manufactured at the Chalmers plant, which was on Jefferson Avenue in Detroit. And the new car was really all new. It featured a 6-cylinder engine with a 7 main bearing crank, a high compression head, and understand, this is high compression for the period. Tetraethyl lead wasn't being added to gasoline yet, so knock was a real problem, but they managed to make this a high compression head for its period. Had a fully pressurized oil system, no splash system, had an oil filter, had an air filter, and the car had 4-wheel hydraulic brakes. These brakes were based on a Lockheed design that the ZSB team had to completely re-engineer to make reliable. The new car was called the Model 70 because it could go 70 miles an hour, and it was introduced as the 1924 Chrysler. It was a great success. Walter Chrysler in 1924 legally transformed Maxwell Chalmers into the Chrysler Corporation, and ZSB Engineering Company ceased to exist. It was folded into the new organization. After 1924, the Chrysler Corporation moved from success to success. The engineering group designed 2 entirely new cars, the low-priced Plymouth that was introduced as a 1928 model, the mid-priced DeSoto, that was a 1929 model. In 1928, they also purchased Dodge Brothers. The Dodge Brothers had already died, and the company was being run by a banking operation, which wasn't doing a particularly good job of it. So Chrysler got Dodge Main here, this factory in Hamtramck, Detroit, in Hamtramck, Michigan. They also got Dodge's engineering department. And now, with the addition of Dodge, Chrysler Corporation had a full line of cars, from low-priced all the way through to high-priced, and Walter Chrysler could compete directly with his old employer, General Motors. More than any other automaker, Chrysler's product development was driven by the engineering department. The centrality of engineering was emphasized by the completion in 1928. And I've said 1928 a lot. It was a very busy time for Chrysler. In 1928, they completed a new engineering building at the former Maxwell plant in Highland Park, Michigan. Building cost $1 million, which was really worth $1 million in 1928. Had 960,000 square feet, 4 floors, featured a cold room for testing at sub-zero temperatures, dynamometers, all sorts of other lab equipment. A 5th floor was added in 1929, a 6th floor in 1936. In 1939, they built an entirely separate, dedicated dynamometer building. So they were serious. Chrysler followed a design process that the ZSB team had developed at Studebaker. University-trained engineers solved problems with theory backed up by rigorous lab testing. For instance, they developed in-house, they developed an apparatus for testing universal joints and drive shafts. They used airflow testing to improve carburetor performance. They built a little wind tunnel to improve radiator performance. Stress patterns in critical parts were visualized and analyzed by making models out of clear plastic and shining polarized light through them. Engine dynamometers allowed extensive testing of fuel systems and durability of engines. There was even a chassis dynamometer that subjected rolling chassis to the stresses encountered on very rough roads. And of course, all his lab work was backed up, followed up by actual road testing. The result was a steady stream of engineering improvements. Those improvements included aluminum pistons, downdraft carburetors, automatic chokes, helical transmission gears for smoother shifting, a rubber engine mounting system that isolated the frame from engine vibrations, replacing riveted brake linings with bonded linings, developing cast iron inner liners for steel brake drums to improve the wear on the wear of the drums, contributing to the development of steel bodies, seal beam headlights, and ultimately developing a semi-automatic transmission called fluid drive, which stayed in production probably longer than it should have. My father had 2 cars with fluid drive. Chrysler even established its own in-house engineering school in 1931, the Chrysler Institute of Engineering. This was a 2-year postgraduate program that blended practical work with classes, and successful completion resulted in a master's degree in mechanical engineering. This institute became a major source of trained engineers for the corporation, and I don't think it's an accident that this program bore a resemblance to this Alice Chalmers Apprentice program that was so important to Zeder and Breer. Now, no discussion of the ZSB team is complete without talking about the DeSoto and Chrysler airflows, because they illustrate both the team's strengths and its weaknesses. Carl Breer said that the airflow story began in 1927 when he saw a flight of what he thought were geese, but they were in a very tight formation. He finally figured out they were fighter aircraft from Selfridge Air Base, which was outside of Detroit. But the streamlined shape of the aircraft set Breer to wondering about air resistance in automobiles. This eventually led to the construction of a small wind tunnel to test wooden models of cars. After testing 50 models, Chrysler engineers concluded that the front end shape was the key factor in determining wind resistance. Along the way, they discovered that actually cars had less wind resistance. The cars of the period had less wind resistance if they were facing backwards, which says something about how unstreamlined these vehicles were. The ideal shape appeared to be a blunt front end and a tapered rear. So as they began experimenting with this and they tapered the rear of the car, they discovered that reduced headroom in the rear seats. So they moved the rear seats forward. So they had to move the front seats forward. So they had to move the engine forward so that it was over the front axle. And you compare that to the older cars where the rear passenger sits right over the rear axle and the engine is actually behind the front axle. Placing the passengers like this allowed you to have a lower floor and a lower center of gravity, which improved handling. In the process, Chrysler also developed an innovative chassis that integrated body and frame. They called it a bridge truss structure. All this took several years. Remember, Breer had his epiphany in 1927. They don't get new cars out until 1934. They introduce the Chrysler and DeSoto airflows at the New York Auto Show in January of 1934. And there's one of the DeSotos. At the auto show, the cars seemed to be well received, but actually Chrysler didn't have very many cars available for sale. When you build something this radical, this big a break from what you've been doing before, you're going to have a lot of problems. And it took a lot of time to get the kinks out of this design. Carl Breer's son, Fred, who was also a Chrysler engineer, said that the early example had a lot of problems. And it just took time to fix them. That time, however, would turn out to be costly because other automakers are looking at these things and they start passing the word around. You know, these cars are too radical. They're too advanced. They're full of problems. You don't want one of those. By the time Chrysler could actually make these cars in volume, turns out they couldn't sell them in volume because the public had that by then become turned off. So when the public was turned off, the dealers became turned off because they weren't selling the cars. And these cars were not this great success that Chrysler had hoped. Part of it, the problem was the front end styling. They fiddled with that in 1936, and 1937. And finally, they gave up and they dropped the whole airflow experiment. Now, I think Fred Breer's concerns about production delays are no doubt accurate. But in the end, I think most observers were and still are right about the primary reason for the car's failure. Most customers just thought they looked funny. That blunt front end tested well in wind tunnels, but not with most people's eyes, especially eyes that were accustomed to cars in the 1930s. And I think it's interesting to compare the airflow with another streamlined car, the 1936 Lincoln Zephyr. The Zephyr had a unitized frame and body structure that I think looks suspiciously like the airflow. And from the windshield back, both cars looked very similar. But from the front, they looked very different. The Zephyr looks more conventional for the mid-30s, even though it's more streamlined. And the interesting thing is the Zephyr was designed entirely by eye, no wind tunnels. When models of these cars were tested in wind tunnels, turned out the Zephyr had a slightly lower drag coefficient. Go figure. I think what you see here is the Zephyr looks like it's going fast, or at least looks like it can go fast. The airflow looks like it's going slow, and it just didn't resonate with people. And the whole debacle, I think, illustrated the ZSB team's strengths and weaknesses. This car was well engineered, it rode well, it handled well, putting the passengers between the axles. Eventually, every car maker adopted that. Moving the passengers forward actually made space behind the rear seat, and you could have an enclosed trunk back there. Carl Breer and his engineers could see the airflow's inner beauty. The lower air resistance, the clever packaging, the innovative frame and body structure. To the engineers, this car was beautiful. The customers, they saw the exterior, they didn't like it, and the cars were failures. Now, the failures of the airflow were not fatal to Chrysler. In 1933, the year before the airflows were introduced, Chrysler became the second leading company by sales in the country, just behind General Motors. And they maintained that position into the 1950s because the more conventional Chrysler Corporation cars were selling well. The last great engineering triumph for ZSB came in World War II. During the war, Chrysler turned out trucks, tanks, aircraft parts, guns, ammunition, rockets, bombs, gyroscopes for navigation. And I'll give a couple of examples that illustrate the engineering team's abilities. Chrysler was very famous for its production of tanks, but the original engine that was specified for the M4 Sherman tank was a 9-cylinder air-cooled radial. Well, those engines were needed for airplanes. So they needed a substitute engine for the tank. And Chrysler came up with what, on the face of it, sounds like a Rube Goldberg solution. It actually worked out very well. They took 5, and you can count them there, 5 of their 6-cylinder automotive engine blocks, arrayed them radially, geared them to a central crankshaft, and produced a 30-cylinder engine with 750 horsepower. And you can really see it here without the plumbing. Up here is how it would look before it was mounted in a tank with all of the fuel and water and exhaust systems in there. They built they powered 7,500 tanks. They built more because sometimes you had to replace engines. There are stories of tanks getting hit and a bank of these engines, one of these banks being damaged, and the engine still runs. The other 4 banks kept it powered. So this Rube Goldberg thing was actually quite successful. Another task was converting the Swedish-designed Bofors 40-millimeter aircraft gun for mass production. These were extremely complex mechanisms that required hand filing and fitting of parts, resulting in 450 hours of assembly time per gun. Chrysler redesigned the guns for interchangeable assembly and reduced production time to 14 hours per gun. They produced over 30,000 single mounts like this, 14,500 twin mounts, and over 120,000 gun barrels. After World War II, the ZSB team broke up. Carl Breer, who was the oldest, retired in 1949. Fred Zeder passed away in 1951, and Owen Skelton retired the same year. The late Richard Sharksburg of Kettering University, I think, summed up the team's importance nicely. He said that Chrysler products and the car buyer were the beneficiaries of a better engineered, more comfortable, and safer car during the years when Zeder, Skelton, and Breer dominated the engineering department of Chrysler. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Wasn't there, or what were the difference between the DeSoto airflow and the Chrysler airflow? And wasn't there a Dodge airflow?
There was a Dodge airflow truck, which was mostly a styling exercise. It was a fairly conventional truck. There is a beautiful example at Henry Ford Museum. They were, a lot of them were turned into tankers for the oil companies. And the fact is, as trucks go, they were gorgeous. That long chassis, the waterfall grille actually worked really well on a truck. The difference between the DeSoto and Chrysler was kind of like the difference later between DeSotos and Chryslers. A little bigger engine in the Chrysler, a little more luxurious, a little higher price on the Chrysler. But they were, as far as the engineering went, they were really the same. Anybody else? Okay, thank you.